Welcome everybody to today's Penn AI Tech webinar. Penn AI Tech is the Penn Artificial Intelligence and Technology Collaboratory for Healthy Aging, an initiative funded by the National Institute on Aging. Today, we're very happy and honored to have with us Dr. Odom as our guest speaker. Dr. Odom is an associate professor in the Doreen C. Harper Endowed Chair of Nursing in the School of Nursing at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and Director of Caregiver and Bereavement Support Services in the UAB Center for Palliative and Supportive Care. Dr. Odom's research focuses on the development, testing, and implementation of early palliative care, laying navigator-led coaching interventions to enhance the coping and decision support skills of family caregivers of care recipients with advanced cancer and heart failure, particularly for under-resourced African American, Black, and rural-dwelling family caregivers. He currently receives funding by the National Cancer Institute. I want to remind our attendees that you can post your questions using the Q&A feature. And after Dr. Odom's talk, we'll have some time for Q&A where we'll be able to discuss these questions. So with that, thank you again, Nick, for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, thanks everyone for joining. It's such a delight to be invited to this forum. Sharing my screen, so hopefully you all see just slides.
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, you all didn't know it, but you're all going to feel better about yourselves because I'm going to present some work of a study that I've done that actually Dr. Damaris was a part of. One of the hardest studies I've ever done, and definitely had a healthy dose of trials and tribulations. And I can certainly offer some insight about maybe what not to do if this is a type of work that sort of overlaps with folks' interests here. So today I'll talk about actually sort of a line of research that's not really my mainline stuff. I mostly develop and test interventions for family caregivers. These are mostly behavioral interventions. This is my first foray into doing smartphone-based studies using an approach called digital phenotyping, which has kind of become a more sort of hottish area over the past decade. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So today I'll talk a little bit about some background on family caregiving in the setting of oncology and their experiences of distress. And then I'll talk about the studies that I've been most recently doing around assessing distress using passively collected smartphone data and modeling that data, which is has been named digital phenotyping. Talk about some methods and results of my first stab at this type of work, and then finally go into discussion and some very painful lessons learned that I've gotten from this. So first, I'll start with some background. About every 5 years, the National Alliance for Caregiving does a very large national survey of caregiving in the US. It's probably the one that's used the most often from an epidemiological perspective to ascertain what's the state of caregiving in this country. The 2025 report should be coming out hopefully in the fall. But in this most recent report, families are asked to check a box about what condition is the one that they are taking care of their person for. And what this report shows is that, unsurprisingly, cancer caregiving represents a massive number of individuals. So in total, there's about 53 million US adults who care for someone with some sort of disability or serious illness. That's about 1 in 5 in the US population. And this is probably an underestimate because you can, for whatever reason, only check one box when it comes to the illness type that you're caring for. And as all of us know, folks with serious illness often have just more than one. But in this instance, those who just endorsed cancer was about 3.3 million. So using that as a healthy sort of underestimate, it's a very large population. They're undertaking tasks that you would typically see a nurse, social worker, or even physician perform in the hospital. This includes managing and monitoring complex symptoms, administering, monitoring, managing medications, breathing treatments. This includes managing oftentimes ventilators in the home, ostomy, wound, and dressing care, G-tube feedings, catheterization. So, things that many of us went to school for many years to learn how to do. These folks are doing it without any training. They're also undertaking many other day-to-day tasks. I won't read the list here. It's not that any one of these is necessarily difficult in and of themselves, but it's the entire aggregate of doing them all, in addition to doing all of the medical and nursing tasks, in addition to seeing someone that you probably care about, suffering with this serious illness. And so I don't think it's that big of an insight here that means that this is usually very distressing to these caregivers. Up to half typically experience clinically high levels of anxiety, about the same proportion experience depression. Many now experience financial strain. Having cancer is not cheap. And then many experience pretty significant pre-loss grief, which further tends to predict post-loss complicated grief and bereavement, which can be very paralyzing for these families. Just to kind of highlight a recent-ish systematic review and meta-analysis, this was one, I believe it was done in 2019 or so. This was 30 studies, included over 21,000 caregivers. You can see some demographics there, mostly female. This was in cancer. The depression rates were estimated in aggregate at 42%, and then anxiety around 47%. So unsurprisingly, very, very stressful role that these folks are undertaking. And some of my own work that I did several years ago now found pretty similar estimates here in the deep south of the US, where not only were folks anxious and depressed, they were typically not taking very good care of themselves. This particular study was looking at the relationship between these rates of anxiety and depression and how well people exercise and ate well and were social and got out and about. So hopefully having convinced you that these folks are pretty stressed out, talk a little bit about the various ways we have stress distress, and then how I've been thinking about it a little differently the past few years. So we often acquire measures of distress. It's necessary for both research and clinical practice. Many of you in a clinical setting may collect such measures. A very common one in cancer is like the distress thermometer or the PHQ 8 or 9, or the various iterations of that one, or the GAD. So they're very common, and these are all self-report measures. And they tell us, they give us a sense of like who is in need of distress, what types of support do they need. If we see someone who's distressed, we can ask them what's bothering them. And then it can also tell us whether or not what we're doing to support them has actually been effective. So it operates not only as an assessment measure, but also sort of a way to evaluate if our interventions and support have been successful. And there's sort of asking people to self-report their distress and health has major limitations, some of which include just the burden, inconvenience, and expense that you have to take to actually complete a questionnaire. I don't know how many of you have actually been sent these questionnaires to do as being a patient or a caregiver in this setting, but it can just take time out of your day. Like, oh, I got to do like another 50-question questionnaire. There's also some limit to scalability. Just simply administering the questionnaire, it takes someone to, if they're administered by a person, it takes their time. If it's done, via web link or even on paper, all these things take time. You have to mail it, you have to get it back. If it's online, this person has to have internet access, and they need to have a smartphone. They need to be able to do it online. They need to be able to take it and complete it, not just do 2 questions and then leave and go do lunch and come back a week later. There's all sorts of difficulties in getting these sorts of self-report measures. There's also a lot of desirability bias when you respond to these questionnaires, meaning you're giving answers that you think people want to hear. And then there can also obviously be a lot of recall bias or inaccuracy. with what people are reporting. We can ask people how they felt over the past month, and maybe 29 out of the 39 of the 30 days they felt great, and one day they felt terrible, and that's what they report. So, our recall and reporting of life experience tends to be very biased by what they call peak experiences and also end experiences. They're often not very ecological. They can be very obtrusive. They're often episodic. Sometimes they can even be triggering. If you're asked about anxiety all the time, it tends to just make you think about anxiety all the time. So in that way, sometimes they can just not be that much fun to do. So smartphones, the things that are probably sitting right next to you. One solution to addressing all of these things is to use passively collected data on our smartphone. So this figure, it's actually higher now. It's now 90% of US adults own a smartphone. And whether we like it or not, they've got about 1 million sensors on them. And here is a little menu of the various sensors that they have, from temperature and humidity to pressure sensors, gyroscope, touch sensors, proximity, microphone. They have ambient light sensors. They have GPS and accelerometer. So, I mean, really, it's a very powerful tools. These sensors are on all the time, sometimes passively, sometimes actively. Like, for example, your GPS is always on. So that, in some ways, depending on how you feel about having a pretty powerful tool with sensors on it all the time, does represent an opportunity, because it's possible to actually model the daily patterns of how we interact with our smartphones. And this has been termed digital phenotyping. It's a term that is probably about 10 years old now, but has sort of received increasing interest, increasing attention. And it's all based on the idea that all these sensors that are on our phones, over time, you can see patterns in how each of us interact. This includes our calls, our text messages, our size of our social groups. And before we start thinking too big brotherish, when I talk about calls, it's not just like they're listening to my conversations. It's also a little bit more simplistic, like the length of your call, how many words were said, the tone of your voice. For text messages, it's like how many characters, and then how many characters were in each text, and who did the text go to? Not necessarily that we know who the person is, but that it went to different people or the same person multiple times, that it went to the same person at the same time of day, on the same days of the week, things like that. Daily activities like sleep, obviously your physical activity, mobility patterns, like where you go. I don't know about you all, but I have an iPhone, and every time I'm getting ready to go home, it tells me how much time it's going to take me with the current traffic to get home from work. I didn't ask it about going home. It just knew that I'm going home. This is my normal route, and here's the traffic, just in case I was curious. So these, again, it's to kind of emphasize that these phones have sensors that are always on, and that they typically are modeling our usual behaviors over time. So this raised the question for me: can we use a digital phenotyping approach? Can we model the way that each one of us individually interacts with our smartphones as a way to passively detect and monitor distress in families and patients? So there's been a number of studies that have demonstrated the promise of digital phenotyping in a cancer context. Here's a few. I won't really highlight any one of them, other than to just simply depict that the use of digital phenotyping is increasingly being used in the oncology space. It's being used in many other spaces as well, perhaps even more so in cancer. But it's increasingly being seen. And I've been thinking about this work within the context of a theoretical model called sort of the caregiving ecosystem model. And I've sort of modified it to fit digital phenotyping. And here's the idea: is that families They have to employ ways to cope with stress, and obviously employ skills to take care of um, this patient. And so whatever they're doing, however they're coping, or whatever actions they're taking every day, like going to appointments or picking up meds from the pharmacy, that's impacting their level of distress or their well-being. And by consequence, that's also probably impacting the patient's distress and level of well-being, given that the patient is primarily relying, at least in the home, on that family member to support them. Oops, wrong way. So in doing all of that, that's impacting their normal daily patterns with their smartphone. So the idea is that if something's going on, like an increase in distress, or the patient experiences more pain, that is going to show up in how it impacts that person's normal interactions with their smartphone. So let me give you an example. If every day you go for a walk after work around the block, and that just creates a pattern. You do that every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Like over time, like that just creates a pattern on your phone, either through GPS or number of steps, things like that. And then let's say that you have a fall, or you're in such pain that you can't do that walk. All of a sudden, you will see that stop. And then you can also see other indicators on your phone that may indicate that something happened. Like you start texting a whole bunch of people, or the GPS seems to indicate that you're going to some new locations, or you're changing the typical locations that you typically go to. All of these together may indicate that something bad is going on, or at least a change. And so that's the idea behind digital phenotyping, is that we all have this unique pattern of how we interact with our phones, that if life goes south, that it might actually show up on our phones in the way that those interactions are being tracked from sort of a data observation end. That could lead to just-in-time intervention. So you could imagine this person falls, and then, it doesn't, maybe they went on vacation. We don't really know. If you go on vacation, you probably interact differently with your phone, but at least we could send a text or something saying, hey, everything okay? And that would be the idea behind these just-in-time interventions, which would allow us to use these passive patterns to potentially detect stress, maybe. And so the idea is that this would be kept within the sort of context of a healthcare team who kept all this information confidential and were responsible with how this data was being used. And this would also be overseen by the larger community to provide guidance on how to protect something which, it's data, it's very private, can be very confidential. I think a lot of us kind of realize now that we're being tracked all the time by Facebook, Amazon, Instagram, you name it. They're tracking us. If you didn't know that, they are. But to do this in a very socially responsible way. Okay, so let me tell you about a study. One of the hardest ones I think I've ever done. The questions were: is it feasible and acceptable to passively collected smartphone data from caregivers and patients with advanced cancer? So the first question is, can we do it? That's it. The second, which is probably what many of us think is more interesting, is what are the correlations between variations in caregiver and patient passively collected smartphone data and their self-reported outcomes? And those were the other two aims of this particular exploratory study. So this was a prospective longitudinal observational pilot feasibility study. The sample targeted, anyway, was 50 smartphone owning family caregivers and smartphone owning patients with advanced cancer. Should note the patients were actually not required to participate. So here's how it worked. They did a baseline survey. They then got assistance downloading an app called B-Way. I'll say more about that in a second. That's the smartphone sensing app that abstracts the raw sensor data. They then would complete brief surveys every 6, 12, 18, or every 6 weeks for 24 weeks. So at baseline, 6, 12, 18, and 24 weeks. And then they got paid for each survey. After the 24-week time period, they then did 30-minute telephone interviews with us, tell us about their experience, and then provide some feedback on how they would feel about if this was an actual clinical model of care. I think you can be. So here's just another way to look at what I just said. If you just start looking at the far left, you'll see family caregivers and you'll see patients. And then if you look across the very top, you'll see that's when they're enrolled. And then you'll see the timeline across the top, where every 6 weeks, if you look at the orange and blue boxes, they did self-reported surveys. And I'll say in a second what surveys they did. And then you can kind of see the payments that they received at each time point. Now, as soon as they enrolled, they downloaded this B-Way app, and data was collected continuously for 24 weeks. You can see what we tried to collect there in that box: GPS, accelerometer, voice on-off charging, call logs, and texting logs. I'll sort of go ahead and tell you, we were successful collecting GPS data. The rest of the data was problematic for a few reasons, and I'll highlight those as we go along. Okay, so the self-report measures for family caregivers, we collected some data on their usage habits of smartphones. Distress, we used the hospital anxiety and depression scale. Quality of life, we used the PROMIS Global Health 10. For burden, that's the Montgomery-Borgata Caregiving Burden Scale. We actually asked caregivers to report the patient's resource use. And then we also asked them to report their the performance status of the patient. Patients, if they were participating, also told us about their smartphone usage habits, their distress, their quality of life, and then their pain, and then their cognitive function, using the scales that you see there. The data that we collected via smartphone, you can see there. Again, for calls, we didn't record calls. It's just like the call length. It's just X number of minutes with a timestamp, and that's for texts. It was just the number of texts per day, and then the length in terms of characters. That's the data that was collected. So this is the B-Way app. The B-Way app was developed by a Harvard team, by J.P. Onella and colleagues. He was funded by a director's award. This app is designed to, it says collect, but really it's making a copy of data that your smartphone already has. And it includes, the app itself includes both sort of the front end, or what the participant sees. It also has a back end. It has apps for both Android and iOS, or Apple phones. They have data storage on a cloud server, and they offer some more or less basic data modeling and analysis tools, because this is big data. It collects data about every 5 seconds. So you can imagine, and this is not technically accurate, but it's like every 5 seconds for 24 weeks, even though there's some on-off periods in there. The passively collected data, it's continuous collected by the B-Way app, and then when a person's phone is within range of a Wi-Fi connection, the data is sort of uploaded. That's so that it doesn't drain the phone's battery. All data, just if you're interested, it's encrypted in transit at rest. It's not stored on the participant's mobile device in unencrypted form, and all the indirect identifiers like IP address, phone numbers, they're all hashed using a hashing algorithm, and all data is tied to an 8-character ID. So it's actually impossible for me to tell, even if I wanted to, like who's who. This, if you're interested, B-Way has a wiki page. If you kind of want to read more about everything from how the app was developed to what features it offers, it's constantly changing. So even this page may be out of date, but they do a pretty good job of trying to keep all of their manuals and stuff up to date. There's the address if you're interested. So when we first recruited for this study, we had a clinic-based approach. And this is what I've typically done for my clinical trials, where we would screen the outpatient clinic schedules of partnering oncologists, and we would identify patients who likely had caregivers, and we would approach them to participate. We would send a letter to eligible patients, and then a coordinator would call by phone to consent. And then we also had a social media recruitment approach where we partnered with a digital marketing agency that's actually local here in Birmingham. It's called High Level Media or High Level Marketing, where they placed ads on Facebook, targeting it to cancer populations. And yes, you can do such things on Facebook. You can actually target certain demographics. And then interested individuals are vetted via sort of an intake process. So one of these approaches made me cry, and the other was pretty great. So I have to say that when I first started, it was all clinic recruitment, and it was pretty terrible. I actually thought the study was just going to totally fail. But then when I had a colleague who did a lot of social media work, and he really helped us figure out how to do social media recruitment, and then everything got way better. And we were actually able to successfully get a pretty solid sample. So this is a consort diagram. I know it's a lot of numbers. You can see at the top there, we ended up approaching 178 eligible caregivers, and 63 of those consented. You can see on the left there that 54 were recruited through Facebook and only 9 through clinic. So there's probably, already some insight that can be gleaned there. If you look to the right, you can see that 115 declined, and I will say that this, it did make me drink a little bit because it was pretty disappointing. And you'll also notice that of these, like most said they were not interested. It wasn't because they had privacy concerns. Only one person, 4 said they had data security concerns. 6 said they weren't a tech person. So interestingly, I thought most people were going to decline to participate because they thought that this would be sort of too big brotherish. But come to find out, especially in our qualitative interviews, people actually thought that the study would just be like too overwhelming, like too much to do. And it's interesting because people who participated quickly realized that they didn't have to do much at all. After they downloaded the app, they just did questionnaires every 6 weeks, and it was actually pretty easy, and they got paid pretty well. So anyway, here are demographics for our, we ended up recruiting 35 caregivers and 14 patients. No, that didn't meet our target of 50, but let me tell you, it was better than the 6 that I thought I was going to have when I was about a year into the project. So I was actually pretty elated with those numbers. And you can see that they pretty much represent the population demographic of the US, more or less. You can notice at the bottom there that they rated their own skills pretty simply on a scale from 1 to 5. How skilled are you at operating a smartphone? And you can see from the 4.1, and again, this makes sense because most people were recruited through Facebook. These are probably already pretty, sort of tech savvy individuals. And so it's not too surprising that they're also pretty good at knowing how to operate a smartphone above and beyond just like making a phone call. Some of our quantitative results. So how did we do this? So we took raw GPS data, and when I say raw, I mean latitude, longitude, and altitude coordinates with a timestamp every 5 seconds. So that data had to be pre-processed, which is actually a pretty big lift I've learned from these types of studies. Just doing that alone is a lot of work. And a lot of the scripts are provided by B-Way. This produced, the nice thing about this type of approach to sort of remote monitoring is you can take just GPS data alone, and you can create a lot of different variables with that data. We created 15 different mobility features that included, for example, proportion of the day not moving, time spent at home, average distance from home per day, and there's a lot of others that are not there. You can actually estimate how long people are sleeping at night, or at least their pattern of when they last touch their phone before they go to bed to when they pick it up in the morning. So for each of these, we did biweekly summaries for each feature. So averages and standard deviations. So, the biweekly summary of the average proportion of the day not moving for a 2-week period, if that makes sense, and standard deviation in that from 2-week periods to 2-week periods, so that we could understand like how many people fluctuate in their usual patterns. And then I'm not a statistician, so I'm going to talk at a sort of a higher level here. We did, but our statistician, Andres Azuero, did principal components analyses. He almost treated it as if each of these variables was like an item on a psychometric instrument. And then he did like what you would do if you did like instrument classical test theory analysis, where you do like factor loadings. If that makes sense, to facilitate the association analysis with PRO outcome data. So it's almost like he's creating a score, so to speak, with these factor loadings that are based on these biweekly summaries of participants' data. And then for a review of different analytic approaches using our approach and others, this is a really good study if you want to check it out. There's actually a lot of different ways to do this type of analysis. And then here's the analytic schema. So just look at the top for a second. These are the participant reported outcome measures that were collected every 6 weeks. So if you just take any 2 sets of measures, forget what week it is, just any 2 sets, and you look at the preceding and the proceeding 6 weeks, there's a difference in those scores, right? So let's just make something up. At the preceding week, I might report a quality of life score of 50, and at the preceding 6 weeks, I report a score of 45. So then you take the difference, that's like -5, right? So you want to see if that difference can be correlated. Now shift your eyes to the sensor data. Can it be correlated with the sensor data that you see there at the squiggly line at the bottom? So if you take the biweekly summaries that are matched with the preceding 6-week questionnaires, and then you take the biweekly summary that were matched with the preceding 6-week summaries, you can then take the difference in those scores in the sensor data and then correlate those change scores with the change scores in the PRO data to see if they sort of predict the variation or the change between those 6-week time points. If you're totally lost right now, I'm sorry. Just bring it up in conversation and I'll try to explain it again. I know there's a lot going on this one. So let me walk you through the table. Just start with the left of the title. These are measures of effect. So how large of sort of a correlation are we talking about in linear regressions of within-person changes? So a single person's predicting their own self, and outcomes predicted by changes in smartphone biweekly features, where they're presented as principal components. So let me walk through this a little bit. Here are the outcomes on the left. You're looking at anxiety, depression, mental health. The top half is caregiver stuff, and then the bottom stuff is patient stuff. Okay. And then if you look here, this is the principal components analysis that I was talking about. You may ask, well, what was component 1, 2, and 3 from like a thematic perspective? We actually didn't do that because, to be honest, like they don't make a whole lot of sense, but they do create scores as you would for like a psychometric instrument. But have them there. And then for each of these sort of sub boxes, you can see if you just look at the very top, caregiver smartphone data predicting caregiver outcomes. Okay. Next one is patient smartphone data predicting caregiver outcomes. So it's caregiver predicting their own outcomes, patients predicting their caregiver outcomes, keep on going down. And you see caregiver smartphone data predicting patient outcomes, and then patient predicting patient, and then caregiver and patient predicting patient. And now it's a lot of combinations, but that's kind of how we did it. You can also tell from each of these that we basically had different sample sizes to work with. And that's because like everything has to line up. Like the patient data and the caregiver data has to completely line up with both their PRO measures and their smartphone data, which actually can be pretty challenging. So anyway, that's what we're looking at so far. This is the money column. This tells you from a statistic of omega squared what the adjusted R squared or effect size is of these correlations. And really anything is kind of like moderately exciting if it's above 0.10. or 0.02 is actually considered a small effect for an adjusted R squared. Adjusted R squared means it's sort of adjusted to a population level. So it's actually a more conservative. If you look at the multiple R to the far right, that's almost what you could call like the observed effect size. An adjusted R square corrects for the population adjustment. So it's a more conservative estimate given our very, very small sample size. But even so, there's some really compelling results, at least from an exploratory sense. You really can't make strong conclusions because the sample sizes are so small. But if you just look down, I think you can see my cursor, things like, depression for both, the caregiver and the patient predicting caregiver outcomes is, intriguing. When you look at the mental health of caregiver and patient smartphone data predicting caregiver outcomes, you can see, and this is going to be one of the conclusions, that when you combine both the patient and the caregiver data, unsurprising, this kind of makes intuitive sense. You're going to have more predictive power to predict anything really. And so when you put the two together, it looked like we were much more able to predict changes in some of these outcomes, mental health and caregiver burden. Oh yeah, I have an arrow there if you are wondering what is small, medium, and large. If you look at the patient outcomes, you can see for anxiety and depression, also some intriguing results, particularly when you pair the caregiver and the patient data together. You can see there could be an additive benefit. And, again, this is actually, it's very small. This is just 11 dyads here. And you might be saying, but didn't you say you had like a lot more in your total sample? Well, the answer is technically yes, but when you're actually having to match the data with time points, this is kind of how many evaluable instances we had. So sorry if this is a super confusing table, happy to go back to it and answer any questions. Big takeaway, there were some compelling results that seem to indicate that yes, this type of digital phenotyping did seem to be able to, at least in principle, with a very small sample, able to predict changes in some of these measures of distress, at least enough to maybe warrant doing something larger. Okay, we also did qualitative parts to this study. We asked about experiences with the study and procedures, concerns about security and privacy, and then feedback on a possible model of care that could include passive monitoring and would send alerts to clinical team if distress was maybe indicated. So the first theme that we saw was that generally people thought the study procedures were fine. They thought, there were some technical challenges. Those weren't uncommon, but in general, pretty positive. This first quote, I think, really is a good one in explaining why so many people actually didn't sign up, because they thought it would be, so much work. It's going to take too much time. And then they kind of realized, but, the study wasn't like that. Like once they actually did it, it was not that much work at all. And then they had issues like connecting to Wi-Fi. There were multiple versions of the app on the App Store at one point, and that caused a whole ton of confusion. So things like that. People could get a new phone and they'd have to re-download the app. Theme number 2, security and privacy concerns were actually mostly minimal. And it was mitigated by our team giving very clear explanations, working with a trusted healthcare system, UAB, which is where I'm at. And then people just kind of already accepting the fact that we're always monitored. And so this didn't seem like that big of a deal from that standpoint to them. And here's some example quotes. You can kind of see how they inform the theme there. I won't read them out loud, but you can kind of read for yourself there some of those quotes. And then the third theme was that a clinical model that used passive smartphone data to automatically trigger assistance. A lot of people thought it actually could be beneficial, but they actually had a lot of reservations about false alarms, which is not unreasonable. And you can kind of see a bunch of the different quotes that inform this theme. A lot of folks did have concerns that it would send false alerts, like if they went on vacation or it was the holidays and things are just different over the holidays, that would, signal bunches of changes, but they wouldn't be bad things. And so there was concern about it doing like a lot of false alarms. So now some discussion and lessons learned. So big takeaway, the quantitative results, while again, they're very exploratory, I thought they did suggest the potential predictive utility of digital phenotyping in a cancer context. And I also thought that modeling both patients and caregivers' data together to predict one or the other actually may further enhance the ability of this approach to predict distress. Most participants surprisingly expressed a few privacy and security concerns, and I do want to stress that that was a big deal to us when we signed people up, was all the things we were doing to make sure their data was secure and private. And then there was an openness to a clinical model, but again, there were concerns about false alarms. So recruitment was very challenging, particularly in clinic. And I think that if this type of care was ever to be translated to an actual clinic flow, that would probably be a major challenge. And I, myself, others would just need to think more about how we would actually do that, given that recruitment in the clinic was so poor. We were successful in social media, but I don't think the clinical model that's centered around social media is going to be all that successful, or at least I haven't seen one. Maybe you will have. So there's that issue. Limitations include, the sample again was very small. Selection bias. I mean, these folks were all on Facebook for a large part, so they're already pretty highly engaged, digital natives or users. And then, again, the poor clinic recruitment, it does raise questions about real world implementation. So this study took a village, and I just want to acknowledge that it took a ton of people to make all of this successful, including Dr. Damaris. Again, thank you for everything you did to advise us and guide us. And so with that, that's all I got. Love to take questions and have some more conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you for this great presentation. And I think we already got a lot of questions in the Q&A, but I want to remind our attendees to also post their questions using the Q&A on your Zoom. Let me see. One of the questions was, how did you confirm or verify that the participants recruited on social media were actually cancer caregivers and patients, since there seems to have been challenges in other studies when recruiting online?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really great question. And I was at first I had the same questions because I never had actually ever considered social media recruitment for these very concerns. Like, how can you verify? I'm always used to going into the EHR to confirm all of these things. And there's a couple of really great papers out there that actually have very structured processes to capture what they call fake shoppers. And so one thing you can do is you kind of have we had an upfront screener that asked questions about like the cancer type and when date of birth and stuff like that. And then we'd wait a week and then we asked the same questions again. And those questions had to match responses, and you can catch a lot of people that way. The other is using something called reCAPTCHA, which is like when you have a bunch of images and this is to try to filter out bots, and you ask people to choose every image that has a car in it or something like that. And we instituted that, and then we actually had a phone screening that we did with folks. And so is it 100%? No, but it was certainly better than what we did. And we tried to we also looked at like the huge variations in like PRO responses that might indicate that people aren't taking the question seriously. So those are some of the things that we instituted. You can go even further and ask for like your oncologist's name and email them. I've seen that. That was more than I had staff to be able to execute.
Another question was about the GPS measures or patterns that you use for depression and anxiety.
Okay, yeah, I mean, the GPS data is It is what it is. You almost might think of it like a Fitbit study where GPS data in and of itself won't tell you anything about people's mood. I mean, I'm an academic. I'd say my anxiety level is probably higher than a lot of people, and I run every day. So if you're just going to correlate like number of steps with anxiety, I mean, it probably differs for different people, but in reality, it doesn't, for my purposes, it doesn't matter that like me and Dr. Damaris have different patterns with our locations. What matters to me is the changes, how much we deviate in our normal patterns, because those normal patterns are what normal life looks like for us. And if we deviate on multiple ones of those indicators, it could indicate that something different is going on in our life, which when you have cancer could be a bad thing. I mean, you don't really know, but it could. So this is to say there is no direct sort of correlation. Like you're not going to magically go a certain number of places as indicated by GPS coordinates and not be depressed. It's really about your normal pattern, if that makes sense.
I'm gonna merge two questions since they're kind of related and have to do with infrastructure and cost. One of our attendees asked, what is the financial cost of the Bayway app? And another attendee is asking whether you had recruited any low-income seniors and were you able to also take advantage of free government smartphones for low-income seniors in the region that you were recruiting from?
We didn't ask about income because I don't like asking about income unless I really think I'm going to use it. So I can't really tell you if, we had a lot of, I can't tell you what the socioeconomic status was of our participants. Mostly because I was just kind of desperate to get participants and I took what I could get. And I wanted to try to limit as many sort of sensitive questions as possible, given that the study itself was already pretty sensitive. In terms of smartphone, no, we didn't avail ourselves of that. I mean, we sort of rely on the argument that 90% of people already own a smartphone, and that to provide someone a smartphone who doesn't already use one kind of undermines one of the key premises of this type of approach, which is that our smartphone is just part of our normal behavioral patterns. So you could just do a Fitbit study. We could buy people a bunch of Fitbits and we could monitor steps and stuff like that every day. If we got a Garmin, we could do GPS. But the idea is that you're introducing a new technology into one's normal coming and going of their day that they're not already used to. A smartphone, in comparison, is something that we already incorporate into our daily life. And so the idea is that if you own a smartphone, you probably have like a habitual pattern that's already integrated into your day-to-day life, whether or not you're in a study. And so that's really sort of the underlying premise of this approach, is that we're leveraging technology that most people already have and that you already use. So I don't have to teach you anything new about using your smartphone, if that makes sense. Good question, though.
And how about the financial cost for the app?
Oh, yes, it's expensive. I think B-Way and Dr. Damaris, you might have to, I think it was $500 per participant for every year of use. So yeah, it adds up. And you might say, gosh, that is enormously expensive. Yeah. And if anyone's ever done an app study, those are really, developing an app is super expensive. And so I kind of understand over and above that, like they also maintain the cloud storage system where all this data is basically kept. And so a lot of the money also goes towards keeping that secure, which I'm happy to pay them to do, because I certainly don't have any idea how to do it. And it offers sort of a service on the back end that we don't really have. So I would say, yes, if you're interested in doing a study like this, talk to them beforehand and tell them what your budget is, and then they can tell you what they can accommodate.
Two questions about your quantitative analysis. One was whether you could explain a little bit more about interpretation and prediction or repeat your explanation. And another question, our attendee says they teach a psychometrics course, so can follow the analysis, but can you say a bit more about the omega square?
Sure. So again, the analysis took, imagine an instrument, right? And it has like 16 items. And just one of the items is like number of locations visited per day on average. Another instrument is how fast on average you got to locations in a week on average. Like what was it has a timestamp for your GPS location and a timestamp. So how fast are you moving? What's the average distance and radius from a central point around which you spend the most time? You can kind of think of this as like the average distance you travel from home per day, if home is where you spend most of the time, which for us it might be work, I don't know. But you take all these variables, right, and you just list them out. And then you do a factor analysis on that, okay? And different ones of these are going to load on an underlying construct. Your next question would be like, what underlying construct is that? And I actually didn't really take that too seriously or even look, because I'm not really interested in that. I just want something that'll create a score and something that would change over time. As sort of, and do it in a way where it uses all the data. So I don't want to just use number of locations visited per day. I want to use that in tandem with the other 15 features that we're generating from the smartphone data, right? So then if you do a principal components analysis, you're able to create scores, or for our sense, at a biweekly summary. So you have like a biweekly summary score. It's the same thing as like on the instrument. Over the past 2 weeks, what's the average number of locations you visited per day? And you actually gave me an accurate response. We use that to then create scores at sort of a biweekly time point. And then you take scores the next biweekly time point, and you see a difference in those scores. You can then correlate that with differences in what I put on my survey for my quality of life, for my pain. So pain at time 1, pain at time 2, you take a difference. At one point I was 10 out of 10, and the prior week I was 2 out of 10. That's a difference of 8. So you got a change score of 8 on my pain score. Now you want to see, is there a change on that principal components analysis score to see if there's a correlation, right? That correlation, the size of it, is that omega squared. That's what that number represents. It's an effect size. A lot of us use Cohen's d. This is just another version of that. Okay. And so you just kind of want to look at effect sizes that are, when you're using the omega statistic, like anything above like 0.05 is actually potentially indicative of something that's sort of relevant. And so we were getting scores, as high as 0.5, even after adjusting for the small sample size. I don't know if that helps. I'm sorry. I know it's sort of confusing. I was confused 95% of the time as well. So, but that's the general approach that we took, and it's not the only approach. There's like a gazillion out there, and I showed a paper where they kind of went through and cataloged all the different approaches that have been used in these types of studies.
We have a question about other things to measure, perhaps in future studies. How about gait characteristics? This could indicate fatigue as compared to self-reports.
Yeah, I mean, I think if this is where I think an informatician is really important, or like a computer scientist. If there's a way to take GPS data and run code to compute a gait metric, I think that would be amazing. I just don't know how to do that. It sounds possible in principle, and that one's gait would seem to potentially vary in a way the GPS coordinates would pick up, but I don't know how to write the code for that. So for our next grant, it'll be an R01 with a much larger sample. I've put in some serious dollars for actually a computer scientist who can actually develop code to create potentially new variables.
Another comment from one of our attendees is about how in the future outreach can also perhaps work with in certain communities with faith leaders, barbershops, and so forth, basically using trusted community figures. Do you think that might be an approach for a future study?
Yeah, I mean, I think engaging community is extraordinarily important. If, one of the successes, potentially, of people actually doing this, I think will largely be based on their trust in the clinical setting to which they're partnering with. So, I mean, I won't lie, like, I think I would be a little hesitant to do it unless I really felt like I trusted my oncologist. I trusted that center. I believe that they are full of a bunch of smart people who've got a moral compass who are going to protect my data. So I think whatever relationship with the community we can establish to ensure that we're addressing all concerns is not just optional, it's a requisite to not only doing these studies, but also potentially implementing a model of care that did this. So, absolutely.
And this relates to a question about digital phenotyping. Obviously, in your case, your participants were aware and consented and were cognitively intact. There's been some literature about the potential for digital phenotyping in populations in opioid use or people with cognitive impairment. Do you think that that calls for even greater attention on the consent process, namely the fact that there are those risks and potential benefits that may not be fully clear to an individual, even a cognitively intact individual at the beginning? They may not necessarily know what exactly they're signing up for.
I mean, we've done our best with our various sort of recruitment approaches to clearly explain exactly what's being done. And I wanted to talk about it more than I did, but one of the reasons we're only doing GPS data is, number one, people feel it's something people understand a little bit better, because if you tell them, it's kind of like a Fitbit, like it's tracking like where you're going, like people kind of get that. If you talking about like accelerometer and texting data, number one, not all platforms like iOS and Android collect that data. They all collect GPS, not all collect texting log data. So that's one thing. And the other is that people generally are a little bit more suspicious of that. And three, it's like easier to explain. So for like someone who's, got chemo brain, or, it's difficult to explain these things, one, you try to explain it in the simplest terms possible, which GPS more or less lends itself to. And two, at this point, I don't think we can overpromise at all. It's just saying, look, like, we're passively collecting this data in the background. If you have a medical emergency, we are not monitoring you. You need to call 911. We actually have that in our materials. Like we can't actively detect your distress and reach out to you. Like if you're having distress, you need to take the normal approach and decision making that you normally would. This is just at this point just an observational study, and that is a key point to come across to people, is that this is not like an active remote monitoring. We're not set up to do that just yet. We can't fly in there if we see something.
Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time. I want to thank you again for this great presentation. It generated a lot of questions. So if we didn't get to your questions, please feel free to email Dr. Odom directly, and we will have a recording of his presentation on our YouTube channel in the next 2 or 3 days. I want to remind everybody that our next webinar is on Thursday, June 12th. We'll have Dr. Walter Curioso, who's going to talk about AI for strengthening healthcare systems in low and middle income countries, a perspective from Peru. And again, Dr. Odom, thank you so much for today's great presentation, and thank you all for attending.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.